$5.6 billion. That is how much the United States spent in the first 48 hours of the Iran war. Not borrowed against. Spent, ignited, transformed into kinetic energy and falling buildings and a column of smoke you could see from orbit. $5.6 billion. To put that in context, that is more than NASA's entire annual budget. It is more than the GDP of Iceland. It is more than the entire annual operating budget of every public school district in the state of Texas combined. In 48 hours.
By day 6, the total bill had reached $11.3 billion. By day 12, $16.5 billion. The war was running at approximately $1.5 billion per day. Not a budget, a consumption rate, a ledger that added a line every 60 seconds and never subtracted one. And while the missiles were flying, a very specific set of financial instruments was performing extraordinarily well.
Every war has a price tag. What changes across centuries is who gets to see it. In 1914, the British public had no idea what the Somme cost in sterling per day. In 1968, the American public did not receive a daily invoice for Vietnam. In 2026, the numbers exist. They are published. They are in CSIS spreadsheets and Goldman Sachs research notes and CFTC filings. The information is not hidden. What is missing is the argument. Nobody assembled the missile cost alongside the family's gas bill. Nobody put the tanker ETF return beside the small business owner's margin compression. Nobody connected the defense CEO's net worth to the SPR drawdown.
This film is that connection. We are going to follow the money. Every dollar, both directions. Who paid, who profited, and why those two lists of names almost never overlap.
The most useful question in financial journalism is not who did this, it is who benefited. Not who claimed to benefit, not who was supposed to, who actually, measurably, in the filings and the portfolio reports and the earnings calls, benefited. The answer in this war involves 8 weeks of pre-positioning in crude oil futures, a Tether stablecoin pipeline through Binance, a London property empire on Billionaires Row, and an emergency production mandate signed at the White House on day 5. We begin with the invoice.
Here is what we know from the Center for Strategic and International Studies War Cost Analysis, published March 13th. Day 1 and 2. $5.6 billion. 319 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Each one costs $3.5 million. That is $3.5 million of machined steel and guidance systems and solid fuel propellant designed to be used exactly once. More than 150 THAAD interceptors, each one costing between $12 and $15 million. And Patriot missile systems depleted by 14.6% of total U.S. stockpile. In 2 days, the United States used 14.6% of its Patriot inventory in 48 hours. The Patriot production line cannot replace that inventory until April 2027 at minimum.
By day 6, the total war bill had reached $11.3 billion. By day 12, $16.5 billion. The war was running at approximately $1.5 billion per day, every single day. To be precise, $1.5 billion every 24 hours. That is roughly the annual education budget of the state of Mississippi burned through each day. That is not a military budget. That is a destruction rate. And the destruction was not symmetric, because munitions production is slow and munitions consumption in modern conflict is fast. The gap between those two rates is not just a logistics problem, it is a balance sheet problem.
There's a word for the condition in which a military burns through consumable inventory faster than its industrial base can replace it. The word is depletion. And depletion in a market economy is an opportunity. Every Tomahawk fired was a Tomahawk that needed to be replaced at emergency production pricing. Every THAAD interceptor launched was a contract waiting to be written. The war was simultaneously destroying assets and generating the demand for their replacement. The beneficiaries of that demand had been building positions for 8 weeks before the first shot.
The Roman historian Vegetius wrote in the 5th century that whoever wants peace must prepare for war. What he did not calculate, what no war theorist ever quite calculates, is the opportunity cost, $16.5 billion in 12 days. That is 3 years of the National School Lunch Program. That is the entire annual budget of the National Institutes of Health. That is 1,400 elementary schools, built, equipped, staffed for a year. The missiles flew, the schools were not built. That is also a decision, and someone made it.
While the missiles were flying, something was happening on the ground in America. Gas prices, which had already been rising over the previous weeks, began their next climb. By the time the war entered its second week, the national average was up approximately 70 cents per gallon. That sounds small. That is not small. At the average American driving rate, 1,000 miles per month, fuel economy of 25 miles per gallon, that is an extra $28 per month per household, times 130 million American households. That is $3.6 billion per month in additional consumer spending on gasoline alone. $9 billion per month, extracted not by a tax, not by a vote, but by the physics of a conflict 8,000 miles away.
3.6 billion per month means something specific. It means less money for groceries, for rent, for the medical bill that was already too big. It means the war's cost was already being distributed downward, from the defense budget, through the oil market, to the family with the credit card balance. The inflation transmission mechanism works fast. The political accountability for it works slow.
The Strategic Petroleum Reserve release, 172 million barrels, the largest coordinated IEA release in history, across 32 countries releasing a combined 400 million barrels, was designed to blunt this. It worked. Partially. For a while. But every barrel released from the SPR is a barrel that will cost approximately $100 or more to replace. That is not a solved problem. That is a deferred bill. Deferred bills do not disappear. They compound. The deferred refill cost of the SPR release is approximately $20 billion, payable at a future date, by a future taxpayer, for a decision made in March 2026.
There is a concept in public finance called intergenerational equity, the principle that the costs of present decisions should not be borne disproportionately by people who were not present for the decision. The SPR release is a textbook case. The barrel is gone now. The $20 billion refill is somebody else's problem. Somebody not yet voting.
Gas was at $3.72 a gallon when the Russia sanctions were lifted. That specific number, 372, will matter in Act 4. Hold it.
Let us be precise about what $1.5 billion per day means in historical terms. A man of 68, at the height of Vietnam, the war cost approximately $21 billion per year, about $58 million per day in then current dollars. The Iran War of 2026 burned through the equivalent of the entire Vietnam annual war budget in less than 2 weeks. In 12 days, it spent what the United States spent in an entire year in Southeast Asia. Wars have not gotten cheaper. They have gotten faster.
One useful framing. Each day of this war cost as much as the entire annual operating budget of the United States Air Force Academy. Each week cost as much as rebuilding a major American city's entire water infrastructure. Each month, had the war lasted a month, would have cost roughly $45 billion. A month of this war would have eliminated the entire U.S. federal deficit for a quarter.
That is an extraordinary compression of economic consequence into a short time window.
It also means that the financial instruments positioned before the war would see extraordinary returns in a short time window. A crude oil options position struck at $90 that you bought when oil was at $78 and held when oil crossed $100 does not require months to pay off. It pays off in days. The temporal compression of modern warfare is also the temporal compression of modern war finance. The positions were built slowly. They paid off immediately.
Here is the question that drives this entire documentary. Not, was it worth it? That is a political question, and politics will outlast the answer. The real question is, who decided it was affordable? Who was in the room? Who had their financial positions arranged to benefit from the answer being yes? Because somebody knew. And the paper trail, in the CFTC filings, in the tanker ETF returns, in the congressional disclosure forms, says they knew 8 weeks in advance. That story begins in Act 2.
There is an old saying in markets, buy the rumor, sell the news. In the Iran war of 2026, the rumor was the 8-week positioning. The news was the first missile. The people who bought the rumor made the money. The people who watched the news paid the bill.
January 5th, 2026. 8 weeks before the first strike, something begins to appear in the CFTC's weekly commitments of traders' filings, the public database in which all major futures positions must be disclosed. Hedge funds and money managers begin systematically accumulating long positions in Brent crude oil futures, not opportunistically. Systematically, week by week, the net long position grows. The analyst who first documented this pattern in detail was Navnor Bawa, writing on March 2nd. By February 24th, 4 days before the war begins, the total net long Brent crude position held by managed money had reached 320,952 lots. 1 week alone saw an increase of 57,766 lots, a single-week accumulation representing roughly $4 billion in notional exposure, built over 8 weeks.
To understand the significance, you need to understand what the CFTC filing reveals and what it doesn't. It reveals the aggregate position, the total bet on higher oil prices, but not who specifically built it or why or what information they were trading on. The filing is a consequence. The cause is elsewhere. What we know is that between January and February 2026, managed money, hedge funds and commodity trading advisors systematically accumulated a multi-billion-dollar bet that oil prices would rise sharply. They were correct. To a degree of precision that is either extraordinary skill, extraordinary luck, or something else.
On the same timeline, 5.8 million Brent crude call options were purchased, clustered at strike prices of $85, $90, and $100 per barrel. Each of those strikes was above the prevailing market price at the time of purchase. They were bets that oil would go significantly higher, not marginally, but to specific thresholds. They paid off within 48 hours of the first strike. In option terms, they went from out of the money to deeply in the money in 1 weekend. The profit on a 5.8 million contract position moving through those strikes is measured in the billions.
The Breakwave Tanker Shipping ETF BW8 was up 98% year-to-date as of February 28th. 98% in less than 2 months in a fund that tracks operational shipping companies. Gold ETF inflows hit $19 billion globally, a record. These numbers, individually, could each be explained by sophisticated macro analysis. Together, they describe something specific and consistent. A market that had already processed the probability of a major Persian Gulf conflict and was expressing it in its position book.
Let us talk about tankers. Specifically, a publicly traded exchange-traded fund called BWET, the Breakwave Tanker Shipping ETF. It tracks the stocks of companies that own crude oil supertankers. In a normal market environment, a tanker ETF trades in a fairly narrow range. It is an operational shipping business, not a speculative vehicle. You do not normally double your money in a tanker ETF in 2 months. Between January 1st and February 28, 2026, BWET gained 98%, almost doubled. In 59 days, while no war had been declared, while tensions by official diplomatic accounts were managed, while the Secretary of State was still making statements about diplomatic channels.
The mechanics of the tanker trade are straightforward to anyone who has spent time in commodity markets. If you know that a conflict in the Persian Gulf is imminent, you know two things simultaneously. First, oil prices will rise because supply will be disrupted. Second, oil will need to be rerouted around the Strait of Hormuz, vastly increasing the ton miles traveled by every barrel going from the Gulf to Europe or East Asia. The rerouting via the Cape of Good Hope adds approximately 15 days to a Gulf to Europe transit. More days at sea means more day rate revenue for the tanker. More revenue means higher stock price. A 98% gain in less than 2 months in a normally stable operational fund is not an accident. It is the market's expression of specific, directional information.
The gold ETF inflow data tells a parallel story. $19 billion flowing into gold ETFs globally in the weeks preceding the strike. A record. Gold is a hedge against uncertainty, against currency debasement, against the kind of macroeconomic disruption that a major regional conflict produces. $19 billion of gold inflow says a large number of investors simultaneously decided to hedge against exactly this kind of event before the event occurred.
Historians have a phrase, the market knows. It is not mystical. It means that somewhere in the aggregation of millions of trades, information is transmitted. It leaks from briefing rooms into bank accounts, from classified assessments into options positions. The direction of travel is consistent. Information flows from those who have it to those who can profit from it before it becomes public. The money moved first. The missiles followed. And the families paying 70 cents more per gallon never had a chance to get in on the trade.
Now for the part that is legal. Under the Stock Act of 2012, members of Congress are prohibited from trading on material non-public information. They are required to disclose trades within 45 days. What they are not prohibited from doing, what the law explicitly allows, is holding stocks in industries they oversee. Defense contractors, aerospace companies, oil. So when members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, and the Senate Intelligence Committee added positions in Lockheed Martin, RTX, L3 Harris, and Northrop Grumman in early 2025, and then held those positions through the 8-week war run-up, and then watched those positions hit all-time highs in the first week of March 2026, every single one of those trades was legal. Disclosed in some cases, legal in all of them.
Think about what that means structurally. A member of the Armed Services Committee receives classified briefings on U.S. military readiness, on potential conflict scenarios, on the specific weapon systems that would be used in a specific regional conflict. That member is not legally barred from holding stock in the companies that make those weapons systems. The information in the briefing, even if it strongly implies a coming conflict, is not material non-public information in the SEC's definition because it is about military planning, not about corporate earnings. The law has a gap in it. The gap is where the money goes.
Legal does not mean uninformed. The question the Stock Act was written to prevent was, did you trade because you knew something the market didn't? The question it was not written to answer is, what does it do to the incentive structure of national security decision-making when the people voting on war have a financial stake in war's outcome? If a vote for military action will increase the value of your portfolio and a vote against it will not, is the vote unaffected? The Stock Act does not think this question is relevant. Behavioral economics disagrees.
The Romans called it pecunia non olet. Money does not smell. It does not carry the scent of the decision that produced it. A stock gain from a war you voted for looks exactly like a stock gain from a war you voted against. The ledger records the profit. The ledger does not record the mechanism. And that is precisely the point.
We have constructed a system in which the financial consequences of a decision are legible, and the decision's relationship to those consequences is deliberately obscured.
March 12th, 2026. 11 days into the war, Fortune magazine publishes an investigation. The headline, "Inside the Binance accounts that sent over $1 billion to Iran-linked entities." We are going to spend the next 9 minutes on this story, because this story is the story of the other side of the war's ledger, the side that never appears in the Pentagon press conference, never appears in the CENTCOM strike count, but appears in the blockchain data with perfect clarity.
According to data in the Fortune investigation, $1.7 billion flowed through Binance to what researchers call Entity A, a cluster of crypto wallet addresses connected to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and, separately, to the Houthis in Yemen who were firing on international shipping in the Red Sea. The mechanism: Tether stablecoins, digital tokens that trade one-to-one with the US dollar, fully convertible, globally liquid, moved along the Tron blockchain. Tron is fast. Tron is cheap. Tron's transaction fees are measured in fractions of a cent. And Tron, at the time of these flows, had limited real-time sanctions screening capability compared to the more regulated Ethereum network. $1.7 billion. Moving in transactions as small as a few $1,000s, aggregating through hundreds of wallets into a single operational war chest.
To understand the architecture, Tether stablecoins are issued by a private company, Tether Limited. They circulate on multiple blockchains. They are used extensively in countries with restricted access to the formal US dollar banking system, including Iran, which has been under comprehensive financial sanctions since 2019. The stablecoin was designed as a financial inclusion tool. It became, in parallel, a sanctions circumvention tool. The Chainalysis 2026 Crypto Crime Report documented over $104 billion in total sanctions, busting flows through the crypto system in the year preceding the war.
3 people stand at the center of this specific network. The first, a 79-year-old Chinese woman, identified in the investigation as a VIP customer of Binance's Chinese operations. She moved $439 million. A 79-year-old woman, $439 million to the IRGC using an app on a phone. The second, a 38-year-old Chinese woman who moved $200 million through the same architecture. The third, a 44-year-old Iranian gold smuggler named in a 2020 UN Security Council report. 3 people, $639 million. One Binance account cluster.
The Binance pipeline was one component of Iran's war financing. The Chainalysis 2026 Crypto Crime Report documented the full scope. Iran's total crypto war chest at the start of the conflict, $7.78 billion. Of that, the IRGC controls more than 50%, approximately $3.9 billion, in crypto assets that can be moved, converted, and spent outside the reach of U.S. sanctions. These are not hypothetical or estimated assets. They are documented on the blockchain, transparent, traceable, and yet legally difficult to seize because of jurisdictional gaps between where the assets sit, where the beneficiaries are, and where the enforcement authority resides.
That's the digital layer. There is also the physical layer. 170 to 200 million barrels of Iranian oil sitting in what are called ghost tankers, vessels that have disabled their automatic identification system transponders, relabeled their cargo manifests as Malaysian crude, and are selling to Chinese refineries at a discount to prevailing market rates. The discount is the cost of the legal ambiguity. The Chinese refineries get cheap oil. Iran gets hard currency at $100 per barrel, which is approximately what oil was trading at during the conflict. That is $14 to $17 billion in accessible oil revenue sitting offshore. Not frozen, not seized,
Just dark.
The shadow banking network. An estimated $9 billion per year in Iranian financial flows moving through informal value transfer systems. Hawala networks connecting Iranian diaspora to the homeland. UAE-registered front companies transacting in Gulf currencies. Real estate transactions in Dubai serving as value stores outside the formal financial system. The aggregate picture? Total accessible war financing available to Iran at the conflict's start between $20 and $30 billion. Enough for 3 to 6 months of sustained military operations at pre-war expenditure rates. The United States was spending $1.5 billion per day bombing a country that had $20 to $30 billion in reserve financing that the bombing could not reach.
This is the structural problem with economic warfare as a substitute for diplomacy. Sanctions compress the formal economy. They make dollar clearing, swift transfers, and legitimate trade harder. They do not compress the informal economy with the same efficiency. And modern finance is sufficiently sophisticated that the gap between formal and informal is navigable by anyone with enough capital and enough lawyers. Iran had both.
One more fact. Zhao Chongpeng, known in crypto markets as CZ, the founder and former CEO of Binance, the largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world, had previously pled guilty to U.S. money laundering charges in November 2023. He stepped down as CEO. He agreed to a substantial personal fine. In early 2025, he was pardoned by the Trump administration. The exchange he founded, the exchange through which, according to Fortune's March 12th investigation, $1.7 billion had flowed to Iranian Revolutionary Guard-linked entities, continued operating throughout this period. The DOJ launched its investigation into those specific flows on March 11, 2026. 11 days into the war.
11 days. The flows that would become the subject of that investigation had been occurring for months. The Fortune investigation suggests potentially years before the first strike. The regulatory architecture that might have caught them, the Bank Secrecy Act, OFAC screening requirements, AML compliance obligations, FinCEN monitoring, existed on paper. It had a well-documented gap in enforcement. Large volume, fast-moving stablecoin flows on secondary blockchains like Tron. The transactions are visible on the blockchain. The beneficial ownership is not. The gap between blockchain transparency and beneficial owner opacity is exactly the gap through which $1.7 billion passed.
The DOJ was not asleep. The enforcement gap is not a story of lazy regulators. It is a story of a regulatory framework designed for the previous generation of financial architecture, being applied to a financial architecture several generations newer. Crypto moves at the speed of code. Regulation moves at the speed of legislation. The gap between those two speeds is measured in billions of dollars per year.
There is a specific kind of institutional irony available only to large democracies. The irony of a state that simultaneously funds both sides of the same war. Not through conspiracy, not through any single identifiable bad actor, but through the accumulation of individually logical decisions. Pardon the crypto founder because the legal case was complex and the political benefit was real. Delay the investigation because the regulatory gap was known and not yet closed. Fail to screen the stablecoin flows because the technology outpaced the compliance architecture. Bomb the IRGC because the security justification was sound. Each decision, individually, rational. The aggregate. The United States government was financing the operation it was simultaneously bombing. At the margin, through the financial system. Legally.
Let us be precise about what this means and does not mean. This is not a claim that Binance intentionally funded the IRGC. It is a claim that the regulatory architecture for large-scale stablecoin flows was insufficient to prevent it. It is a claim that the gap between the legal standard, know your customer, anti-money laundering, OFAC screening, and the operational reality of a high-volume global crypto exchange processing billions of transactions per day was wide enough to drive $1.7 billion through. It is not a conspiracy claim. It is a systems claim.
The distinction matters because the systems claim is harder to fix. A conspiracy requires identifying and prosecuting individuals.
A systems failure requires redesigning the architecture. And architecture redesign is slow, political, and expensive. The crypto industry's lobbying budget in Washington in 2025 was the largest in its history. The regulatory gap was not closed. The money moved.
In 2026, the U.S. government was simultaneously bombing Iran's military infrastructure at a rate of $1.5 billion per day, and providing the financial rails through which $1.7 billion reached the IRGC. Not the same departments, not the same people, not any kind of coordination. The left hand and the right hand of the most powerful financial system in the world were operating in direct structural opposition to each other. The Department of Defense was transferring value to one side. The financial system, through the Tether-Tron Binance architecture, was transferring value to the other.
This is what economists call policy incoherence, what historians call institutional contradiction, what the person paying for the war on both ends calls something considerably less technical. The war economy is not a coherent system optimized for any particular outcome. It is the aggregate consequence of 1,000 individually rational decisions made in 1,000 separate rooms by people who never had to share a spreadsheet.
March 12th, day 11 of the war. Gas is at $3.72 per gallon, the number I asked you to hold. Oil has crossed $100 per barrel. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve release, 172 million barrels, the largest in history, has not been sufficient to bring prices back to pre-war levels. Spring break starts in 4 days. Tens of millions of American families are about to drive to beaches, to relatives, to vacation destinations they booked before the war. The administration faces a simple political reality. American families on vacation are paying 70 cents more per gallon than they were 3 weeks ago. That is visible. That is felt in the wallet. That votes in November.
So the administration makes a decision that would have been unthinkable 48 hours into a war against Iran, a country that is Russia's strategic ally, a country that Russia is supplying with intelligence and support throughout the conflict. On March 12th, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent authorizes the sale of Russian oil already loaded on tankers and, quote, stranded at sea. The specific framing, stranded at sea, no significant financial benefit to Russia, is precisely chosen regulatory language designed to navigate OFAC restrictions by arguing that the oil was effectively already sold, already in transit, and that refusing the sale would benefit nobody. The OFAC exemption is technical. The political reality is not.
The economics. Approximately 7 to 10 million barrels of Russian crude at $100 or more per barrel. Between $700 million and $1 billion gross revenue to Russian oil sellers at minimum. The official American estimate, no significant financial benefit to Russia, relies on a narrow accounting of the specific transaction. Zelensky's estimate of the total financial benefit to Russia across all associated flows and market signals, $10 billion for the war. One of these estimates was produced by people with a reason to minimize the number. The other was produced by someone watching his country being invaded by the state receiving the payment.
The political economy here is precise and important. The Trump administration was simultaneously fighting a war against Iran, Russia's strategic partner, and paying Russia, Iran's strategic partner, to moderate domestic gas prices. The two decisions are not contradictory in the logic of domestic American politics. A war 12,000 kilometers away is abstract. Gas at 372 is tangible. Democratic leaders respond to tangible. And 372, during spring break, is very tangible indeed.
The European Union's response to the Bessent decision was immediate and sharp. Multiple EU member governments, including Germany, France, and the Baltic states, issued formal objections within 48 hours. NATO allies who were simultaneously providing intelligence support and logistics assistance for the U.S. operation against Iran, found themselves being asked to publicly call on Washington to reverse a decision that Washington had already made. The argument was simple and unanswerable. You are fighting a war against Russia's strategic ally. You are simultaneously paying Russia. These two positions are in direct contradiction with each other.
The deeper problem was not the contradiction. Contradictions in US foreign policy are not historically unusual. The deeper problem was the signal. The European sanctions architecture against Russia had been built painstakingly over 3 years, with enormous economic cost to European energy markets and European industrial competitiveness. It was built on the premise that the United States was a reliable, consistent partner. The Bessent decision, made for domestic American political reasons, demonstrated that that premise was conditional. Conditional on whether the cost to American consumers was tolerable. When the cost became politically uncomfortable, the architecture could be adjusted. That is a different alliance than the one Europeans thought they were in.
The Trump administration's response, framed through Secretary Bessent, was to invoke market stability and economic sovereignty. We are a market-driven economy. This is a market-driven decision. It was a response that treated a geopolitical alliance like a vendor contract. Deliverable when convenient, renegotiable under price pressure. The Europeans had no legal recourse, no enforcement mechanism. The Atlantic Alliance is not a binding contract with penalties for breach. It is a shared commitment, and shared commitments are only as durable as the perception of shared interest.
NATO allies protested. The protest had no enforcement mechanism. The oil was sold. Gas prices moderated slightly. Spring break proceeded. This is what power asymmetry inside an alliance actually looks like. Not in a summit statement about shared values, but in a unilateral market decision that the other members cannot override. The alliance survived, but it was a different alliance on March 13th than it had been on March 11th.
In the annals of strategic decision-making, few trade-offs have been as nakedly documented as this one. America lifted sanctions on its adversary's major strategic partner, fractured its European alliance relationships, and undermined 3 years of coordinated economic pressure on a country actively supporting Iran. In exchange for a modest reduction in domestic gasoline prices during a leisure travel week, the cost-benefit analysis, in geopolitical terms, it is entirely rational, if you define rational as optimized for the next news cycle and the next approval poll.
The political science literature calls this audience costs. The domestic political cost a leader pays for foreign policy decisions that are visible to voters. In this case, the audience cost of gas at 372 was higher than the audience cost of alliance fracture. Alliance fracture happens in diplomatic cables and foreign ministry statements. Gas prices happen at the pump, every time someone drives to work. The decision reflects the relative weight of these two audience costs precisely.
Which brings us to the fundamental tension this documentary returns to throughout. Who is the decision-maker optimizing for? Not rhetorically, mechanically. In each major decision of this war, the decision to strike, the decision to lift Russian sanctions, the decision to release the SPR, the decision to invite defense CEOs to the White House, the answer to who benefits is consistent. It is not the family at the gas station. It is not the NATO ally in Warsaw or Warsaw. The beneficiaries are specific, identifiable, and positioned. The costs are diffuse, distributed, and absorbed by people who had no seat at the table.
The answers haven't been assembled in the same room until now. That is what this room is for.
The Bishops Avenue, North London, locally known as Billionaires Row. It is one of the most expensive residential streets in the world. Multi-million-pound mansions set back behind stone walls and security gates, properties from the Gulf, from Russia, from China, From everywhere that great wealth accumulates and seeks a permanent, stable home in a jurisdiction with reliable property rights and strong rule of law. One of its most valuable residents, property purchased in 2014 for £33.7 million, belongs, according to Bloomberg's March 8 investigation, to a corporate structure connected to Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated supreme leader, the new supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, a man whose country was being struck by Tomahawk cruise missiles at $3.5 million each, while his London property empire, exceeding £100 million total, sat untouched, unsanctioned as property, and legally protected by the same British legal system whose government was diplomatically supporting the military campaign against his country.
Bloomberg's March 8 investigation, how the son of Iran's supreme leader built a global property empire, documents the full scope. The Hilton Frankfurt Gravenbruch, a five-star hotel in Germany's financial capital. Hotels in Mallorca. A villa in Dubai's most exclusive residential district, described in real estate marketing as the Beverly Hills of Dubai. A $10.5 million penthouse in Toronto sold in 2020, after the sale, but before the war. And the centerpiece, over £100 million in UK property holdings, concentrated on the Bishop's Avenue, a 10-minute drive from the Israeli embassy in London.
A 10-minute drive from Billionaires Row to the Israeli embassy is not incidental. The Bloomberg reporting notes it directly. The geographical proximity of Mojtaba Khamenei's London real estate to the Israeli diplomatic mission is an illustration of a principle. Economic warfare and conventional warfare operate on different maps. The missile flies toward Iranian military infrastructure. The wealth sits in North London. The gap between those two geographies is the gap in which impunity lives.
Bloomberg's investigation reconstructed the financial architecture with specificity. Step 1. Iranian oil sales routed through a UAE-based intermediary. The UAE, which maintains formal relations with Iran despite international pressure, functioning as a commercial valve between the Iranian economy and the global financial system. Step 2. Funds moved through the Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank. Step 3. Ziba Leisure Limeninti, incorporated in St. Kitts and Nevis, a Caribbean tax haven with minimal beneficial ownership disclosure requirements and a visa program that offers citizenship in exchange for investment. Step 4. From Ziba Leisure, funds capitalized a German company, Allsko Gravenbruch Hotelbetriebsgesellschaft, MBH. Step 5. That German company controls the management agreement for the Hilton Frankfurt Gravenbruch, one of Germany's finest five-star hotels, operating normally, welcoming guests, generating returns, today.
The key individual in this architecture, Ali Ansari, a UK-sanctioned Iranian businessman with a Cypriot passport, Cyprus being a EU member state with a controversial investment for citizenship program. The UK sanctions designation exists on paper. The Cypriot passport was under investigation for potential revocation as of Bloomberg's reporting. Yet the shell company network Ansari is connected to, continues to operate. The sanction designates the individual. The shell company holds the asset. The individual does not hold the asset. The sanction is the designation. The shell company is the delivery system. These two things exist in parallel legally.
The specific shell companies documented in the Bloomberg investigation: Birch Ventures Limited, Isle of Man; Ziba Leisure Limited, St. Kitts and Nevis; A. Leisure Limited, Veritas Realis Investment Limited; Midas Oil Industries FCC UAE; Midas Oil Trading DMCC UAE. 6 companies, 5 jurisdictions. 0 single point at which any one jurisdiction can see the entire chain. This is the architecture of opacity. Each link is, individually, potentially legal. The chain collectively moves sanctioned wealth outside the reach of the sanctions regime.
This is not unusual. It is normal.
The Khamenei family is estimated to hold between $95 and $200 billion in assets hidden outside Iran. The range is wide because the secrecy is effective. The secrecy is effective because 5 legal jurisdictions each provided one link in a chain that none of them sees in full. This is not a failure of individual laws. It is a success of fragmentation. The sanction is a national instrument. The wealth is a global one.
The total estimated Khamenei family wealth hidden outside Iran, between $95 and $200 billion. The range is wide because the secrecy is effective, and because it has been maintained across multiple changes in Iranian leadership, across multiple rounds of US and EU sanctions, across multiple years of financial investigation by multiple intelligence agencies. The U.S. dropped Tomahawk cruise missiles on Iranian military infrastructure for 12 consecutive days. The London property is still there. The Frankfurt Hotel is still open for business. The Dubai Villa is still occupied. No missile has a guidance system programmed for the Bishop's Avenue. Military power and financial power are not the same power.
This is the documentary's deepest uncomfortable fact. The people who bear the costs of war, who pay 70 cents more per gallon, who lose jobs to supply chain disruption, who serve in uniform in hostile seas, who live in the Iranian neighborhoods where the bombs fell, are not the people whose wealth survives the war intact. This is not an accident. It is an architecture. Economic warfare, sanctions, financial isolation, asset freezes was explicitly designed to change this dynamic, to extend the reach of state power into the private wealth of adversaries. It is a design that has had limited success. The networks are faster than the regulators. The shell companies are cheaper to create than the lawyers it would take to unwind them. And the legal gaps between jurisdictions are precisely what the architecture exploits.
The return on investment for constructing this kind of offshore wealth architecture, lawyers, corporate formation fees, annual compliance costs, is extraordinarily high when the alternative is having your assets seized. At an estimated $95 to $200 billion, even a 1% annual cost of maintenance is almost irrelevant. The architecture pays for itself in the first day of protection.
Naomi Klein, in The Shock Doctrine, argued that crisis is an opportunity for capital to restructure in its own favor while attention is elsewhere. She was writing about neoliberal economic reform in post-crisis economies. She was also, unknowingly, describing this. Every war is a redistribution event. The question is always, redistribution toward whom? The answer, in this war as in most, runs consistently upward. The war destroys the middle. The wealth survives in the shell company.
March 6, 2026. Day 5 of the war, 3 days after the first strikes. The President of the United States convened a meeting in the White House. The attendees were not generals. They were not diplomats. They were CEOs. The CEOs of Lockheed Martin, RTX, formerly Raytheon Technologies, Boeing Defense, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. The 5 largest defense contractors in the United States by revenue. They were not invited to discuss strategy. They were not invited to discuss foreign policy. They were invited to discuss production expansion. The word that came out of that meeting, according to reporting from CNBC and Defense One, quadruple.
Specific commitments. THAAD production, from 96 interceptors per year to 400 per year, more than a 4-fold increase, requiring new production lines, new workforce, new supply chain capacity. Tomahawk cruise missile production, to exceed 1,000 per year from a base that had already been running below demand. These are not incremental adjustments. These are multi-year industrial transformation orders. They require capital investment. They require facility expansion. They require long-term supply chain contracts with hundreds of sub-tier suppliers. They require, above all, long-term contract certainty from the government, the kind that generates predictable revenue streams
and predictable margins for 5, 10, 15 years.
On the day of the meeting, Lockheed Martin's stock had already gained 40% since June 2025, a 34.7% year-to-date gain at the time of the meeting. Northrop Grumman had hit an all-time high above $705 per share. RTX had gained 110% over 3 years. The iShares Defense ETF, a broad basket of U.S. defense companies, was up 14% year-to-date, outperforming the broader market significantly. The CEOs arrived at the White House wealthy. They left with a mandate to become substantially wealthier, backed by emergency government production contracts at premium pricing.
There is a phrase from the First World War era, merchants of death. It was used by critics of the munitions industry to describe companies that profited from warfare. The phrase fell out of use because it was too simplistic. Defense manufacturing is complicated, dual-use technology is real, and the people who work in these industries are not villains. What it captured, imprecisely, but not inaccurately, was the structural reality that for some participants, war is not a cost. War is a revenue event. The White House meeting on March 6th was a revenue event, conducted at the highest levels of American government, 3 days into a war.
Contracts that result from that meeting will be awarded through the Department of Defense's acquisition process. The official who co-chairs the Defense Acquisition Board, the body that approves major defense contracts, is Steve Feinberg, Deputy Secretary of Defense. Before his government appointment, Feinberg was the founder and CEO of Cerberus Capital Management, one of the largest private equity firms in the United States, managing over $60 billion in assets. Cerberus has historically held substantial positions in defense-related companies and industries adjacent to defense contracting. Feinberg's transition to government included a partial divestiture process. He recused himself from specific identified conflicts of interest. He remained in his role for the rest.
Let me be precise about what this is and is not. This is not a claim of illegal conduct. The recusal process is the legally prescribed mechanism for managing exactly this kind of situation, and Feinberg followed it. What this is a description of is a structural condition. A man who built his considerable personal wealth through investment in defense sector companies was appointed to the most senior acquisition role in the Department of Defense at the precise moment when that department was issuing the largest emergency defense contracts in a decade. The system designed to manage the conflict, the recusal, manages specific named conflicts. It does not and cannot manage the systemic fact of a procurement official whose professional network, whose fund investors, whose former colleagues, and whose general frame of reference are embedded in the defense investment world.
There is a word in economics for when the people who award contracts have a systematic financial interest in the outcome of those contracts. The word is not corruption. It is not fraud. The word is misaligned incentives. The distinction matters enormously in criminal law. It matters less in outcomes. The outcome of a system with misaligned incentives, even a perfectly legal one, consistently favors the party whose incentives are aligned with the decision. In this case, the contracts go to the defense sector. Steve Feinberg's professional network is in the defense sector. These two facts coexist within the law. Whether they coexist within the spirit of public service is a question the law does not adjudicate.
The term revolving door has been in political vocabulary since the 1960s. It describes the movement of individuals between regulatory or government positions and the private sectors they regulate or fund. In every generation, the door revolves faster. The gap between regulator and regulated closes. The boundary between public interest and private benefit blurs. This is not unique to defense. It is most visible in defense because the numbers are largest.
The House Armed Services Committee has jurisdiction over defense policy, authorization of weapons systems, and the legal framework for military operations. The Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee controls the money. the actual budget authorizations that turn White House production mandates into funded contracts. Their members vote on defense budgets, contractor authorizations, supplemental appropriations, and war powers resolutions. In the weeks before and after the Iran war began, multiple members of these committees held significant positions in the defense companies whose stocks were rising to all-time highs.
The Stock Act, passed in 2012, requires members of Congress to disclose trades within 45 days. It does not require divestment from industries they oversee. It does not bar a member of the Armed Services Committee from voting for a defense budget or a supplemental war appropriations bill that benefits a company in whose stock they hold a position. The rationale for this permissiveness is separation of powers. Congress argues that requiring divestment would deter qualified people from public service. The consequence is a legislative body in which the people deciding the size of the defense budget simultaneously hold financial stakes in the companies receiving that budget.
The iShares Defense ETF was up 14% year-to-date by early March 2026. Lockheed, plus 40% since June 2025. Northrop, all-time high above $705. RTX up 110% over 3 years. These are not hypothetical or speculative conflicts of interest. These are measurable, documented financial gains accrued to specific identified decision-makers during the precise period of their decision-making authority over the industry generating those gains. The numbers are in the 45-day disclosure filings. The filings are public. Nobody went to prison. Nobody lost their committee chairmanship. The hearing rooms remained occupied. The stocks went up.
The political philosopher John Rawls asked us to design institutions from behind a veil of ignorance, as if we did not know in advance which position in the system we would occupy. A system designed from behind the veil of ignorance would not allow the legislators who fund the war to hold stock in the companies paid by the war. But the veil of ignorance has never been the operating principle of American institutional design. The operating principle is disclosure, and disclosed conflicts are, apparently, the kind we have decided to live with.
Between 2020 and 2025, the 5 largest U.S. defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, RTX, Northrop Grumman, Boeing Defense, and General Dynamics, spent a combined $110 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. $110 billion. That is the number documented by the Board World in its March 15th analysis of defense sector capital allocation. $110 billion that could have expanded THAAD production lines from 96 per year to the 400 per year now being demanded on an emergency basis. That could have built the Tomahawk manufacturing capacity that will now require premium-priced emergency investment. That could have prevented the 14.6% depletion of Patriot stockpiles in the first 48 hours of a regional conflict that had been publicly assessed as a risk for years.
To be precise about why it didn't happen, stock buybacks return capital to shareholders at current valuations, immediately measurable, immediately rewarded by the market, immediately visible in quarterly earnings presentations. Production capacity expansion generates returns over 5 to 10-year timelines, at utilization rates dependent on government contracts that may or may not materialize, in a sector where the government is the only customer and the government can change its procurement priorities between election cycles. The capital allocation decision between buyback and production investment was, from a shareholder return perspective, entirely rational. The market rewarded the financial engineering. The executives were compensated at record levels. The investors were satisfied. The production capacity was not built.
Now, the same government that created the incentive, through defense appropriations that rewarded financial efficiency over industrial capacity, through a procurement culture that valued current cost minimization over future availability, is paying emergency premiums for the shortfall that the incentive created. The companies that chose financial engineering over production investment are receiving emergency contracts to fix the problem their financial engineering created. The public is paying, again, for the private optimization. This is not a paradox. This is the system working precisely as designed.
The economist John Kenneth Galbraith called this dynamic private profit public cost. He was writing about environmental externalities. the cost of pollution borne by the public while the profits of production are privately retained. He would recognize the defense procurement version of the argument immediately and without hesitation. The profit of the buyback was private. The cost of the production shortfall is public. The emergency contract that bridges the gap transfers the public cost back to private revenue at a premium. This is not corruption. This is the market, working precisely as advertised.
Here is what happened to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the first 2 weeks of the Iran war. Before the conflict began, roughly 415 million barrels of crude oil stored in underground salt caverns along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana and Texas. The reserve exists for strategic purposes: supply disruption, national emergency, energy security during conflict. In the first 2 weeks of the war, the administration released 172 million barrels, the largest single-nation SPR release in U.S. history, coordinated with 32 IEA member countries releasing a combined 400 million barrels globally. After the release, 243 million barrels remaining in the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, 35% of total SPR capacity. The lowest level since 1982, 44 years.
12 days. 243 million barrels covers 12 days of U.S. consumption. That is the strategic buffer the United States maintained at the end of 2 weeks of a regional conflict. If the Strait of Hormuz remained closed for more than 12 days after the SPR was effectively exhausted, or if another supply shock hit simultaneously, the United States would have no strategic petroleum buffer remaining. None. The reserve was designed to last through a crisis. It had been drawn down to where it could only sustain the beginning of the next one.
The refill cost at $100 or more per barrel, approximately $20 billion. $20 billion in deferred obligations, sitting in the national accounts, waiting to be paid by future taxpayers who had no vote in the decision to draw the reserve down. The IEA release moderated prices. That was its stated purpose, and it worked. Gas came down a few cents. Spring break was manageable. The $20 billion refill bill was not mentioned in the press conference announcing the release. It was not the point. The point was $3.72 at the pump. The $20 billion is somebody else's problem, scheduled for a future somebody.
The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was established in 1975, in the wake of the 1973 Arab oil embargo, as a permanent lesson in strategic foresight. The idea that a great power should maintain energy independence sufficient to outlast a supply disruption without economic collapse. In 2026, its use as a domestic political instrument, a tool for managing pump prices during an election-sensitive vacation week, represents, in some sense, the reserve's original strategic premise being consumed by a different kind of strategy.
Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point. It is a piece of geography that has determined energy geopolitics for 50 years. Through that 21 miles flows, in normal times, approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply and 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas. Qatar's LNG, which European utilities depend on to fill storage before winter, exits through the strait. Saudi Aramco's exports exit through the strait. The UAE's production exits through the strait. In normal times, the risk premium for transiting the strait, the additional insurance cost above the baseline, is a fraction of a percentage point of a vessel's hull value. By mid-March 2026, according to the Insurance Journal's reporting of March 17th, maritime insurance premiums for strait transit had surged more than 1,000%. The risk premium had become 5% of hull value. Transit cost for a single VLCC supertanker, $4 million per crossing. The Strait of Hormuz had become the most expensive waterway on Earth by a margin that was not close.
The cargo rates followed immediately. Asia to Europe container rates, the commercial blood supply of the global supply chain, the price signal that determines when goods move from factory to store shelf, jumped 19%. Air freight rates soared as shippers diverted from maritime to airborne transport for time-sensitive cargo.
The cost of that diversion passed directly to consumers in the form of higher product prices. Companies that had built just-in-time supply chains assuming stable ocean shipping faced margin compression across every product category: electronics, pharmaceuticals, automotive parts, textiles, industrial components. The war found them in their shipping lanes.
The insurance market is, in some ways, the most honest market in the world, because it prices actual risk in real time with no political motive. A 1,000% surge in Hormuz premiums is the insurance market saying, the probability of losing a ship in this waterway has increased by a factor of 10. That assessment has direct economic consequences. Every vessel that cannot afford the premium cannot transit. Every vessel that can afford it passes the cost to its cargo owners, who pass it to retailers, who pass it to consumers. The $4 million transit premium is distributed across millions of units of goods, invisibly as a slightly higher price for everything.
There is a concept in systems theory called choke point amplification, the disproportionate systemic consequence of disrupting a single critical node. The Strait of Hormuz is the world's most consequential choke point. A single 21-mile waterway carries 1/5 of global energy. That concentration of consequence in a single geography is not an accident of nature. It is the result of decades of infrastructure investment decisions made in a period of relative stability. The world built the system assuming the strait would remain open. The war demonstrated the assumption.
Goldman Sachs research published March 12, 2026. The bank cuts its U.S. economic outlook. Recession probability over 12 months. 25%, up from an already elevated pre-war baseline. The direct mechanism is simple. Every 10% rise in oil prices adds approximately 0.2 of a percentage point to the consumer price index. Oil had risen more than 10% from pre-war levels. The inflationary addition was already in the pipeline, in the literal sense that the oil was flowing at the new price, and the price was already embedded in supply contracts and futures hedges that would not be renegotiated until they expired.
But the pre-war baseline was already fragile, which is the detail that makes the Goldman call serious. GDP in Q4 2025 had been revised down to 0.7% annualized growth, half the previous estimate of 1.3%. The revision came from CNN's reporting on March 13th, citing Bureau of Economic Analysis data. 0.7% is not a recession, technically. It is not growth that can absorb an external shock. An economy growing at 0.7% is an economy with no margin. The war provided the shock. The margin was not there.
25% probability of recession. That is 1 in 4. That means the family who absorbed 70 cents more per gallon, who watched their grocery bill rise, who noticed that the credit card balance was not going down this month, they were standing in a 1 in 4 probability space of living through the beginning of a recession. Not caused by their decisions, not announced in advance, not voted on. Transmitted to them through the oil price, which was transmitted from the Strait of Hormuz, which was transmitted from a decision made in a room they never entered, by people whose financial positions were arranged to benefit from the answer being yes.
The economist, Hyman Minsky, observed that stability breeds instability, that the longer an economy is stable, the more leverage accumulates, and the more fragile it becomes to disruption. The Q4 2025 GDP revision suggests an economy that had been leveraged into fragility before the war. The war was the disruption. The Goldman call was the market's assessment that fragility plus disruption equals 25% probability of the thing that hurts ordinary people most: a recession.
While the United States drew down its strategic petroleum reserve to 12 days of consumption, China maintained a different posture. China's strategic petroleum reserve covers 104 days of consumption. 104 days. The equivalent of more than 3 months of warfare, 3 months of strait closure, 3 months of energy shock that China could absorb without fundamental economic disruption. China is not unaffected by the Hormuz closure.
Between 45 and 57% of China's oil imports transit the strait. But China's 104-day buffer means it can wait. It can absorb the initial shock. It can negotiate from a position of time, which is the most valuable position in any negotiation.
The contrast with other major economies is stark and deliberate. South Korea had 9 days of LNG storage when the war began. 9 days. Europe was at 30% of storage capacity in early March, entering a critical period for LNG replenishment before the following winter. The Hormuz closure's impact on European gas storage calculations was immediate and severe. LNG that should be flowing from Qatar to European terminals was either stuck in the Gulf or was being rerouted at enormous cost premium. The energy security vulnerability that European governments had spent 3 years trying to reduce after the 2022 gas crisis was being re-exposed by a conflict 10,000 miles away.
The knock-on effects reached further than energy markets. Sulfur prices rose 16% in the weeks following the conflict's start, a consequence of reduced sulfur content crude throughput affecting the feedstocks used in fertilizer production. Fertilizer production is the foundation of global food supply. A 16% rise in sulfur prices means a rise in fertilizer costs. A rise in fertilizer costs applied at planting season across Asia means a rise in food production costs. The war's economic radius extended from the Strait of Hormuz to the rice paddies of Asia. In the food inflation data of autumn 2026, the March missile strikes will be visible as a price signal.
The asymmetry is structural, and it is a policy choice. Countries with strategic reserves, built by deliberate long-term investment, funded by decades of consistent policy, were relatively insulated from the war's energy shock. Countries that had run their reserves down, for quarterly budget reasons, for market efficiency arguments, for the financial logic of just-in-time resource management, were not. This is not fate. It is a choice made in advance of the crisis and collected with interest during it.
So, who profits when missiles fly?
The hedge funds who spent 8 weeks systematically accumulating 320,952 Brent crude lots before the first strike. $4 billion in notional exposure built in the public CFTC filings available to anyone who looked. The tanker ETF that gained 98% year-to-date on the pre-positioning of a war that was, apparently, predictable from financial markets, even if it was not predictable from the news broadcasts. The defense contractors whose stocks hit all-time highs in the first week of conflict, Lockheed Martin up 40% since June 2025, Northrop Grumman above $705, RTX up over 100% in 3 years, and who left the White House on day 5 with emergency production mandates to quadruple output of the exact weapons that had just been consumed.
The Iranian war financiers who moved $1.7 billion through Binance to the IRGC using a Tether-on-Tron stablecoin architecture that the regulatory system had documented gaps in and had, for reasons both technical and political, not closed. The ghost tanker operators sitting on 170 to 200 million barrels of Iranian crude off the coast of Malaysia. $14 to $17 billion in accessible oil revenue, dark, untracked, waiting for the optimal moment. Mojtaba Khamenei, whose £100 million London property empire on Billionaires Row sat untouched throughout 12 days of Tomahawk strikes against his country's military infrastructure. The missiles did not have a guidance system for the Bishop's Avenue.
And who pays?
The family at the gas station, absorbing 70 cents more per gallon and $3.6 billion per month in aggregate consumer extraction. The truck driver spreading out 3 months of fuel receipts, watching the trend line he already knew. The small business owner doing math behind the counter, finding that the numbers no longer add up the same way. The 25% of Americans living inside Goldman Sachs' recession probability window, 1 in 4, chosen not by their decisions, but by the transmission mechanism of a conflict they did not choose. The South Korean households with 9 days of LNG. the Asian farming communities absorbing a 16% surge in fertilizer costs from sulfur price pass-through. The future American taxpayers who will refill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at $100 per barrel. $20 billion, deferred, accruing.
Every war is in part a balance sheet. The balance sheet of the Iran War of 2026, incomplete, still being written, many of its entries still classified, already has one consistent feature. The people in the profit column are not the people who went to war. The people who went to war are in the cost column. This observation is not new. What is new is the documentation. The numbers are in the CFTC filings, in the CSIS spreadsheets, in the Bloomberg property records, in the Chainalysis crypto crime report, in the Goldman Sachs research note, in the insurance journal's Hormuz premium data, in the Navnur Bawa analysis of pre-war positioning. The ledger is public. The frame was missing.
The frame matters because the frame determines the question. Without it, the question is, who won the war? With it, the question is, who won from the war? These are different questions with different answers. The first is answered by military historians. The second is answered by following the money. We followed it for 60 minutes. The trail was not hard to find. It was in the public record, waiting for someone to read it in the same order.
This was the frame.